Here's a question that'll change how you see history. What built the British Empire? Was it the red-coated soldiers marching across continents? The naval fleets that ruled the waves? The explorers planting flags on foreign shores? Wrong. It was something far more powerful. Something invisible. Something that could topple kings without firing a single shot. It was money. Specifically, the promise of money that didn't even exist yet. The British Empire wasn't conquered with gunpowder alone. It was purchased with IOUs, financed with ledgers, built on a radical idea that would reshape the entire world. That debt could be a weapon more devastating than any cannon. Think about this for a moment. At its peak, Britain controlled nearly a quarter of the world's land and population. This tiny, rainy island off the coast of Europe somehow ruled India, dominated Africa, commanded the seas, and dictated terms to nations 10 times its size. How? The answer isn't in the history of warfare. It's in the history of banking. This is the story of how a handful of men in wigs and waistcoats created a financial system so powerful, so ingenious, and so ruthless that it would allow Britain to conquer the world not through superior armies, but through superior accounting. This is the story of how paper became more powerful than steel. This is the story of how banking built the British Empire. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll never look at your bank statement the same way again. Let's rewind to the 1600s. Europe is a mess. Actually, mess is too gentle a word. It's a bloodbath. The 30 Years' War has just ravaged the continent, killing millions. Kingdoms are broke. Currencies are worthless. Trust? That's a luxury no one can afford. In England, things are particularly chaotic. King Charles I has just been beheaded. Yes, beheaded. His own people put him on trial, found him guilty, and chopped off his head in public. The monarchy has collapsed. Oliver Cromwell, a military dictator, has taken control. When he dies, they dig up his corpse, hang it in chains, and stick his head on a spike. This is the world we're talking about. This is the foundation upon which the British Empire will be built. But here's the real problem. England is completely, utterly, catastrophically broke. The country has been at war for decades. First, civil war. Then wars with the Dutch. Then wars with the French. Wars cost money. Lots of it. And England has run out. Back then, if a king needed money, he had 3 options. 1, raise taxes. But there's only so much you can squeeze from peasants who are already starving. 2, borrow from wealthy merchants. But good luck convincing them to lend when the last guy who lent money to the king had his assets seized and was lucky to escape with his life. 3, debase the currency. Melt down the gold coins, mix in cheaper metals, and pretend they're worth the same. This is basically counterfeiting, but when the king does it, it's called monetary policy. None of these options work for long. The economy is in shambles. Credit has evaporated. Without credit, you can't fund wars. Without funding wars, you can't defend your borders. Without defending your borders, you get invaded. It's a death spiral. And here's the thing about gold that everyone forgets. There's never enough of it. Gold is heavy. It's scarce. It sits in vaults doing nothing. You can't create more of it. You can only dig it out of the ground, which takes time, labor, and more money. In a gold-based economy, your power is limited by how much shiny metal you happen to have in your basement. That's it. Your army can be the bravest in the world, but if you can't pay them, they'll desert. Your ships can be the finest ever built, but if you can't afford supplies, they'll rot in harbor. By the 1690s, England is in a desperate situation. King William III is fighting yet another war with France. He needs money. The treasury is empty. The government's credit is shot. No one will lend. England is about to lose. Not because its soldiers lack courage. Not because its strategy is flawed. Because it's broke. And then a small group of very smart, very ambitious men propose something absolutely radical. Something that has never been tried before on this scale. Something that will change everything. They propose creating money out of nothing. July 27th, 1694. On this date, a Scottish merchant named William Patterson and a group of investors receive a royal charter. They're creating something new, the Bank of England. Now you might think, okay, so what? They open a bank. Big deal. But this isn't just a bank. This is a revolution disguised as a boring financial institution. Here's what makes it genius. The Bank of England is given the right to issue banknotes. Paper money, not backed by gold sitting in a vault, but backed by government debt. Let that sink in. They're creating money based on the government's promise to pay it back someday. Here's how it works. The government needs money for the war. The Bank of England loans the government £1.2 million, an absolutely staggering sum. Where does the bank get this money? They don't have it. Instead, they issue paper notes that say the government owes you this amount. These notes start circulating as money. People accept them because they trust that the government will eventually pay them back. And here's the beautiful, terrifying part. The government pays back the loan using taxes collected in the future. They've essentially created money from future promises. It's debt-based currency, credit-based power, and it works. Within a few years, the Bank of England is funding not just one war, but an entire empire's worth of ambitions. But why does this work in England when it failed elsewhere? 3 reasons. First, the Bank of England is independent from the king. This is crucial. Previous monarchs borrowed money and then simply refused to pay it back. What are you going to do? Sue the king. Good luck with that. But the Bank of England is chartered by Parliament, not the king. Parliament represents the wealthy merchant class, the landowners, the people who actually pay taxes. They have a vested interest in making sure debts get paid. This creates something magical, credibility. When you lend to the Bank of England, you're not lending to one mortal king who might die or decide to rob you. You're lending to an institution backed by the most powerful economic class in the country. Second, the system is transparent. The bank publishes its accounts. People can see where the money's going. This builds trust. Trust creates liquidity. Liquidity creates power. Third, and this is the most important, the bank creates a cycle of dependency that becomes impossible to break. Here's the cycle. The government borrows from the bank to fund a war. The war generates expenses that require more borrowing. The bank issues more notes. The government collects more taxes to service the debt. The taxes give the notes value. The value creates trust. The trust allows more borrowing. Round and round it goes. It's a perpetual motion machine powered by faith. And here's the thing. It doesn't just work for war. It works for everything. Need to build ships? Borrow from the bank. Need to fund expeditions? Borrow from the bank. Need to pay pensions to widows of soldiers? Borrow from the bank. The Bank of England becomes the beating heart of British power. Not because it has gold, but because it has something far more valuable. Credibility, structure, and the ability to create money when it's needed most. Within a generation, England goes from a broke, chaotic kingdom to a financial powerhouse. France, by contrast, is still operating on the old system. When the French king needs money, he basically shakes down the wealthy, seizes assets, and occasionally executes bankers for fun. This doesn't exactly inspire confidence. Spain has mountains of gold flowing in from the Americas. But gold just sits there. It doesn't multiply. Spain ends up declaring bankruptcy 6 times during this period because they never figure out credit. England, with its clever paper system, can mobilize resources far beyond its immediate wealth. They discovered something profound. Money isn't real. It's not gold or silver. It's trust. It's belief. It's a shared hallucination that becomes reality because enough people participate in it. And once you understand that, once you control the mechanism that creates that trust, you can do anything. You can fund armies without gold mines. You can build fleets without treasure. You can conquer the world on credit. And that's exactly what Britain does. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Meet the East India Company. Founded in 1600, this is technically a private business. A corporation. Its official job is to trade spices, textiles, and tea from Asia. But by the 1700s, it's become something else entirely. It's a corporation with its own army, its own navy, its own territory, its own laws. It negotiates treaties with foreign kings. It wages wars. It collects taxes from millions of people who've never even heard of Britain. The East India Company is the world's first corporate superpower, and it's powered entirely by banking. Here's how it works. The company doesn't have enough capital to fund its operations. Trading expeditions are expensive. Ships cost money. Soldiers cost money. Bribing local rulers costs money. Everything costs money. So the company borrows. It issues bonds. It sells shares. It creates a sophisticated financial structure that allows it to raise massive amounts of capital from investors in London who never have to leave their drawing rooms. These investors don't care about spreading Christianity or planting the British flag. They care about returns, profits, dividends, and the East India Company delivers. But here's the dark genius of it. The company discovers that conquering territory is more profitable than just trading. Why negotiate with a local prince when you can overthrow him and take direct control? Why pay taxes to a foreign government when you can become the government? In 1757, at the Battle of Plassey, a company military officer named Robert Clive defeats the Nawab of Bengal. This isn't officially a British military victory. It's a corporate military victory. A company just conquered a region with more people than all of Britain. Bengal becomes a company possession. The company collects taxes. It controls agriculture. It monopolizes trade. And every ounce of profit flows back to London, where it's used to fund more expansion, pay more dividends, and borrow more money. The system is brilliantly vicious. The company uses borrowed money to conquer territory. The conquered territory generates tax revenue. The tax revenue pays back the loans with interest. The profits allow the company to borrow even more, and the cycle expands. By the 1800s, the East India Company controls most of India. Not Britain, not the British government, a corporation. But here's what makes this possible. The financial infrastructure back in London. The Bank of England provides credit. The London Stock Exchange provides investors. The insurance market at Lloyd's of London insures the ships and cargo. The legal system enforces contracts. It's an entire ecosystem designed to turn risk into profit, conquest into cash, and empire into equity returns. Let's pause and appreciate how insane this is. A group of businessmen in London, sitting in comfortable offices, are making decisions that affect millions of people on the other side of the planet. They're deciding what crops get planted, what taxes get collected, who lives, who dies. They're not accountable to voters. They're accountable to shareholders. This is financial imperialism in its purest form. And it works because of one thing. Money flows efficiently through the British banking system. When a company ship leaves London bound for India, it's financed by bonds traded on the London Stock Exchange. When it returns with cotton and spices, those goods are sold. The profits are calculated and dividends are distributed to investors in Edinburgh, Manchester, and Bristol. Money moves at the speed of paper. Compare this to other European powers. The French have colonial ambitions, but their financial system is a disaster. Borrowing is expensive. Corruption is rampant. There's no reliable credit market. The Dutch have a sophisticated trading company too, but it's not backed by the same deep financial infrastructure. The Spanish are still hoarding gold like medieval dragons, which does them absolutely no good. Britain, meanwhile, has created a machine that turns promises into empires. And the East India Company is just the beginning. The model gets replicated everywhere. Royal Africa Company in West Africa. Hudson's Bay Company in Canada. British South Africa Company in Southern Africa. Same formula. Private capital, government backing, military force, and financial engineering. Everywhere Britain expands, banking follows. Or more accurately, banking leads. Because here's the secret. You don't conquer with soldiers. You conquer with credit. Soldiers just enforce the deal. Let's talk about war. Because between 1700 and 1815, Britain is almost constantly at war. War of Spanish Succession. War of Austrian Succession. 7 Years' War. American Revolution. Napoleonic Wars. War after war after war. And every single one costs a fortune. But here's the thing. Britain wins most of them. Not because British soldiers are better. Not because British generals are brilliant. Britain wins because it can afford to keep fighting. Let's focus on the Napoleonic Wars, because this is where the power of British banking really shines. It's 1803. Napoleon Bonaparte has crowned himself Emperor of France. He controls most of Europe. His armies are legendary. His military genius is undisputed. Britain is in serious danger. Napoleon's strategy is to strangle Britain economically. He creates the continental system, blocking British trade with Europe. His plan is to bankrupt Britain, to make it so expensive to fight that the British give up. It's a good strategy. It should work. It doesn't. Why? Because Britain doesn't need to win quickly. It just needs to keep fighting. And Britain can keep fighting because the Bank of England can keep lending. Here are the numbers, and they're staggering. The Napoleonic Wars cost Britain over £1.6 billion. That's roughly equivalent to £200 billion today. An unimaginable sum. Where does this money come from? Not from taxes. The British economy couldn't possibly generate that much revenue. Not from gold reserves. Britain doesn't have enough gold to fight a war this big. It comes from bonds, government debt, IOUs. The Bank of England and private banks lend the government money. That money pays soldiers, buys ships, purchases supplies, and funds Britain's allies. But here's the genius part. The entire world believes Britain will win. International investors, even in neutral countries, buy British bonds. They lend money to Britain because they trust the British financial system. They've seen it work for 100 years. They believe they'll get paid back. Meanwhile, Napoleon's finances are a disaster. France can't borrow effectively. Why? Because French kings have a long history of defaulting on loans. Nobody trusts them. Napoleon tries to fund the war by looting conquered territories, but looting is a one-time cash grab. It's not sustainable. Britain, on the other hand, has a sustainable system. Borrow, fight, collect taxes, pay interest, borrow more. The cycle works because people believe in it. In 1815, Napoleon invades Belgium. The Battle of Waterloo is about to happen. In London, the stock market is in a panic. If Napoleon wins, British bonds will become worthless. A banker named Nathan Rothschild has positioned himself to receive early news of the battle's outcome. When he learns that Wellington has won, he starts buying up bonds before anyone else knows the result. Within hours, he makes a fortune. This story, whether entirely accurate or not, illustrates a profound truth. The empire is run from the stock exchange as much as from the battlefield. Money and war are inseparable. After Waterloo, Britain emerges as the undisputed superpower. France is beaten. Napoleon is exiled. The map of Europe is redrawn. But Britain's victory isn't just military. It's financial. Britain now has the most trusted currency, the most sophisticated banking system, the deepest capital markets. When other countries need to borrow money, they come to London. When businesses need financing, they come to London. When investors want safe returns, they buy British bonds. The entire global economy starts to orbit around the Bank of England. And this is where things get really interesting. Because Britain is about to do something unprecedented, turn its currency into a global weapon. By the mid-1800s, Britain has a problem. It's a nice problem to have, but it's still a problem. The empire is too big. Britain controls Canada, Australia, India, huge chunks of Africa, islands in the Caribbean, strategic ports in Asia. All of it needs to be connected, administered, and defended. But more importantly, all of it needs to be paid for. How do you manage an empire that spans every continent? How do you move money from London to Bombay, from Singapore to Cape Town, from Hong Kong to Jamaica? The answer: you make your currency the global standard. In 1816, Britain officially adopts the gold standard. Here's what this means. 1 British pound is defined as a specific amount of gold. You can, theoretically, walk into the Bank of England, hand over a paper pound note, and receive a fixed amount of gold in return. This sounds simple, but it's revolutionary. Suddenly, the British pound isn't just another currency. It's as good as gold. Actually, it's better than gold because it's easier to transport, easier to divide, and easier to use. If you're a merchant in Egypt, or a plantation owner in Jamaica, or a trader in Shanghai, you want to be paid in British pounds. Why? Because you know it's stable. You know it's backed by gold. You know you can convert it anywhere in the world. And here's where it gets brilliant. Britain uses this trust to control global trade. Let's say you're a Brazilian coffee exporter. You want to sell coffee to France. How do you do the transaction? You don't trade Brazilian currency for French currency. That's too complicated. The exchange rate is unreliable. There's too much risk. Instead, you trade in British pounds. The Brazilian exporter sells coffee to a French buyer. The French buyer pays in pounds. The Brazilian exporter takes those pounds and uses them to buy British manufactured goods, or converts them to Brazilian currency, or saves them in a London bank. Either way, the transaction flows through London. This happens with everything. Cotton from America, tea from China, rubber from Malaysia, wheat from Australia. Everything gets priced in pounds. Everything gets financed by British banks. Everything flows through London. Britain becomes the world's financial hub not because it produces the most, but because it controls the medium of exchange. Think of it like this. Imagine if every time anyone in the world bought or sold anything, they had to use your currency in your banks. You make a small cut on every transaction, a percentage here, an interest payment there. Multiply that by every trade happening across the entire planet. That's what Britain achieves. By the late 1800s, more than half of all global trade is financed by British banks. The majority of international transactions are conducted in pounds. London is the undisputed financial capital of the world. And here's the kicker. Britain doesn't even have to be militarily involved in a region to control it financially. Argentina, for example, is technically independent, but its entire economy runs on British investment. British banks fund Argentine railroads. British companies manage Argentine infrastructure. When Argentina needs to borrow money, it borrows from London. The same is true across Latin America, across Asia, across Africa. These countries might have their own governments and their own flags, but their economies are tied to British finance. This is the evolution of empire. In the old days, you conquered a place and planted your flag. You sent soldiers and governors. You directly controlled the territory. But that's expensive. Soldiers need to be paid. Administrators need salaries. Rebellions need to be crushed. The new model is more elegant. You control the money supply. You lend to their governments. You finance their infrastructure. You become so deeply embedded in their economy that they can't function without you. And if they ever step out of line, if they ever challenge your interests, you don't send gunboats. You cut off credit. You crash their currency. You call in debts. You create a financial crisis that topples their government without firing a shot. This happens over and over. Egypt, 1882. The Egyptian government borrows heavily from British banks to modernize. When they can't repay, Britain uses this as justification to occupy the country. Not for military reasons, for financial ones. It's called protecting our investments. The Ottoman Empire, slowly crumbling throughout the 1800s, is propped up by European loans. But those loans come with conditions. Financial advisors, trade agreements, concessions, death by debt. China, after losing the Opium Wars, is forced to open its markets and pay massive reparations. To afford this, China borrows from British banks. The debt becomes a tool of control. By 1900, Britain controls the largest empire in human history. But the real empire isn't the pink-colored territories on the map. The real empire is the invisible network of financial control that spans the entire globe. It's every pound note in circulation in Buenos Aires, every loan extended in Istanbul, every trade financed in Singapore. Britain has created something unprecedented. A global system where their national interest is the default setting for the world economy. And it's all built on banking. Let's talk about power. Real power. Not the kind of power that comes from armies or navies, but the kind of power that makes armies and navies irrelevant. Financial power. By the early 1900s, Britain has weaponized banking itself. Here's how it works. If you're a country that wants to develop, you need capital. You need money to build railroads, factories, ports, schools. Where do you get this money? You borrow it. And where do you borrow from? London. But London doesn't just lend to anyone. British banks assess your creditworthiness. They look at your government's stability, your economy's potential, your willingness to play by their rules. If you're cooperative, if you open your markets to British goods, if you protect British investments, if you align with British interests, then congratulations, you get a favorable loan with reasonable interest rates. If you're difficult, if you nationalize British-owned companies, if you challenge British dominance, then sorry, you're high risk. Either you pay through the nose with sky-high interest rates, or you get nothing at all. This is power. This is how you control the world without colonies. Let me give you a concrete example. Persia, modern-day Iran. In the early 1900s, Persia is technically independent. It has its own Shah, its own government, but it's broke. The government needs money desperately, so they borrow from British banks. In exchange, they grant Britain control over Persian customs, trade regulations, and a little thing called oil rights. The Persian government has effectively sold its sovereignty for a loan. When Persian nationalists try to resist, the British don't need to invade. They just tighten financial pressure, cut off credit, watch the economy collapse, wait for a more compliant government to emerge. This pattern repeats everywhere. You want to understand why Britain ends up controlling so much of the Middle East? Oil is part of it, sure, but the real answer is debt. Same with Africa. European powers carve up the continent at the Berlin Conference of 1884. But the infrastructure of control, the actual mechanism of dominance, is financial. Build a railroad? Financed by British banks. Build a port? Financed by British capital. Need to pay government salaries? Borrow from London. The interest payments drain these countries' resources. The debt obligations force them to export raw materials at low prices to pay back loans. The trade terms enrich British merchants and impoverish local populations. It's extraction by ledger. And here's the really insidious part. The system is designed to be inescapable. Let's say you're a colonized country. You've been forced into this system. Your economy is structured around exporting cheap raw materials and importing expensive manufactured goods. You decide you want out. You want independence. You want to develop your own industries. Good luck, because you can't develop industries without capital. And capital only comes from one place, the imperial banking system. And that system only lends for projects that serve imperial interests. You're trapped. You can't develop because you can't borrow. You can't borrow because you're not creditworthy. You're not creditworthy because you haven't developed. The logic is circular and suffocating. Britain perfects this system so thoroughly that other empires copy it. France, Belgium, Germany, they all try to create their own versions of financial imperialism. But none match the scale and sophistication of the British system. Why? Because the British had a 100-year head start. Because London had become the global financial hub. Because the pound had become the global reserve currency. Network effects matter. Once everyone is using your currency, your banks, your insurance markets, it becomes incredibly difficult for alternatives to emerge. Now, you might be thinking, this all sounds pretty terrible. And you're right. It is. But here's the uncomfortable truth. This system also funded development. Those railroads in India, British financed, yes, but they still connected the country in ways it had never been connected before. Those ports in Africa, built to extract resources, absolutely, but they also enabled trade. The telegraph lines, the legal systems, the infrastructure, much of it was built not for altruistic reasons, but because imperial capitalism needed it. It's a brutally mixed legacy. On one hand, the system generated immense wealth and development. On the other hand, that wealth flowed overwhelmingly in one direction, and the development served imperial interests first and local needs second, if at all. By 1914, Britain is at the absolute peak of its power. The sun never sets on the British Empire. British banks finance projects on every continent. British insurance companies insure ships on every ocean. British investment trusts own assets in every corner of the globe. And then everything changes. The First World War breaks out. And the war that was supposed to last months drags on for 4 years. 4 years of industrial-scale slaughter. 4 years of spending that make the Napoleonic Wars look like a bargain. Britain borrows and borrows and borrows. But this time, the creditors aren't British. They're American. The balance of financial power is shifting. By 1918, Britain has won the war, but lost its financial dominance. The empire is still there. The territories still colored pink on the map. But the economic foundation is crumbling. The pound is weakening. Gold is flowing to America. New York is emerging as a rival financial center. The age of British financial supremacy is ending. But the system, the model, the idea of banking as a tool of empire, that doesn't die. It just gets a new owner. So what happened? The British Empire officially ends in the decades after World War II. India gains independence in 1947. African colonies follow in the 1950s and 60s. Hong Kong returns to China in 1997. The maps get redrawn. The flags come down. The empire, in its political form, dissolves. But here's the thing. The system never really ended. It just evolved. Let's zoom out for a moment and look at today's world. Where is the global financial capital? London is still in the top 3, alongside New York and Hong Kong. What language is international business conducted in? English. What legal framework governs most international contracts? English common law. Where are most major banks headquartered? London, New York, and a handful of other Western financial centers. The empire disappeared, but the infrastructure of empire remains. Think about the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, created after World War II. These institutions lend money to developing countries. They provide capital for development projects. Sound good, right? But look closer. These loans come with conditions. Policy reforms, market liberalization, privatization, austerity. The developing country needs the money desperately. They agree to the terms. The loan is given. The money flows in, then flows right back out to pay international consultants, buy foreign equipment, and service debt. Years later, the country is deeper in debt than when it started. The infrastructure built serves export industries more than local needs. The wealth gap has widened. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same model Britain pioneered 300 years ago. The names have changed. The institutions are global now, not explicitly British. But the structure is eerily similar. Or consider the role of credit ratings agencies. 3 companies, Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch, essentially determine which countries can borrow money and at what cost. They rate countries like teachers grading students. A downgrade can trigger a financial crisis. An upgrade can spark investment. These private companies have power that rivals governments. Power to destabilize economies with a press release. How is this different from British banks in the 1800s determining which countries were creditworthy? It isn't. It's the same mechanism with a corporate logo instead of a Union Jack. Here's another example. The petrodollar system. After Britain's decline, the United States took over as the world's financial superpower. In the 1970s, America made a deal with Saudi Arabia and other oil producers. Sell oil in dollars, and will provide military protection. Suddenly, every country that wanted to buy oil needed dollars. To get dollars, they needed to trade with America or hold dollar reserves. The dollar became the global reserve currency, just as the pound had been before. Same system, different country. Now, I'm not saying Britain still controls the world. That would be absurd. What I'm saying is that the model Britain pioneered, using finance as a tool of geopolitical power, using debt as a mechanism of control, using currency dominance to extract wealth, that model never went away. It was too effective, too elegant, too profitable. So it got replicated, expanded, and globalized. Today's global economy operates on principles that would be instantly recognizable to a British banker from 1850. Capital flows from the financial centers to the periphery. It funds development, but on terms favorable to the lender. The periphery exports resources and labor, imports manufactured goods and expertise. Debt accumulates. Dependency deepens. The profits flow back to the center. The geography has changed. The players have changed, but the game remains the same. And here's what's fascinating. London itself never really left the game. Today, the city of London, that square mile of financial institutions, remains one of the most powerful financial centers on Earth. It handles more foreign currency transactions than any other city. It's the global center for international banking. Brexit happened. The British Empire is long gone. Britain is no longer a superpower. But the city of London? Still thriving, still central, still moving trillions. Because the infrastructure built during the imperial era, the legal frameworks, the banking relationships, the expertise, the networks, all of that persists. Let me tell you something that might blow your mind. There are countries today that still use currencies pegged to the pound or the dollar. There are economies still structured around exporting raw materials to the West. There are financial systems still dependent on access to London's or New York's capital markets. The formal empire ended, but the informal empire, the financial empire, never did. So what do we learn from all this? First, money is power, not symbolic power. Real, tangible power to shape nations, topple governments, and determine the fate of millions. Second, debt is a weapon, perhaps the most effective weapon ever created. It's quiet, it's legal, and it's incredibly difficult to fight. Third, empires don't really end. They transform. The British Empire became the American-led global financial system. And when that system eventually changes, it'll become something else. But the core mechanisms, credit, debt, currency dominance, those will remain. There's a famous saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire. That was literally true once. British territory existed in every time zone. But here's a modern version. The sun never sets on pound-denominated debt, on contracts written in English law, on financial instruments created in London. The empire dissolved politically, but it crystallized financially. And this brings us to today's world and the questions we should be asking. When developing countries struggle with debt, who benefits? When currencies collapse, who profits? When entire economies are structured around exporting to wealthy nations while importing expensive finished goods, who designed that structure? The answers aren't simple. Economics never is. But understanding the history helps us see the patterns. There are people and movements today fighting to restructure this system. Debt relief campaigns, calls for a new global financial architecture, demands for reparations and redistribution. These aren't new fights. They're the continuation of struggles that began the moment the Bank of England opened its doors in 1694. The struggle between creditors and debtors, between the center and the periphery, between those who control capital and those who need it. Some people look at British imperial history and see adventure, exploration, and civilization spreading across the globe. Others see exploitation, extraction, and systematic theft. Both views contain truth. History is complicated, but what's undeniable is this. The British Empire wasn't built primarily by soldiers or missionaries or explorers. It was built by bankers, by men in offices making calculations, issuing loans, and moving numbers on ledgers. The redcoats enforced it. The politicians justified it. The generals fought for it. But the bankers designed it. Think about that the next time you hear about international loans, trade agreements, or currency crises. Think about the fact that a financial system created centuries ago to fund one nation's imperial ambitions became the template for how the entire world economy operates. Think about how debt, something invisible and abstract, becomes chains more effective than any made of iron. The British Empire at its height controlled a quarter of the world's population and landmass. That empire fell, but the ideas behind it, that credit is power, that he who controls currency controls commerce, that debt is the most effective tool of control, those ideas won. They didn't just survive the empire's fall. They became the foundation of the modern world. Today, when a country can't pay its debts, international institutions step in with loans and conditions. When a currency collapses, it's often because international investors lost confidence. When a developing nation struggles to grow, it's often because it's trapped in debt cycles. This is the legacy we're living in. The British Empire ended, but the empire of debt never did. It just went global. So here's where we started. Empires aren't built with armies alone. They're built with debt, with promises, with ledgers, with the magical transformation of future obligations into present power. The British figured this out before anyone else. They created a system so effective, so sophisticated, so deeply embedded that it outlived the empire itself. The soldiers are gone. The colonies are independent. The pink has faded from the maps, but the balance sheets remain. The debt obligations persist. The financial structures endure. Banking built the British Empire, and then banking outlived it. That's the real story. Not of conquest, but of credit. Not of force, but of finance. The empire that never really ended because it was never really about territory. It was always about money. And money, unlike empires, never dies. It just changes hands. Thanks for watching.